welcome again to the Acid Trash Jamboree, and to another of my forays into the unforgiving world of noise, drone, industrial, and power electronics music. We start this episode with Tarpit by White Rock, originally a hyper-scarce 2004 self-release CDR, which was reissued on both CD and LP by Troubleman Unlimited back in 2006. Now, if you're a devotee of that whole early to mid-2000s global experimental underground explosion, which I was on about in the video I made on the Invisible Pyramid compilation, then White Rock could be considered a bit of a supergroup, which on and off for a couple of years brought together the main members from the fairly well-known projects Religious Knives and Mouthus. And yeah, Tarpit, their one and only full length, still sounds pretty good to me all these years later. The first of the two 20-minute plus pieces here starts off very strangely, all muffled gurgles and dial-up internet chirpings, before percussionist Nate Nelson establishes a steady, tribal pulse for the weird, gravelly layers of electronically damaged guitar, vocals, and whatever the hell else to dance around for the remainder. Whilst you can tell this was recorded at high volume, thanks to the occasional stretches of clipping, the piece itself never quite boils over into pure noise, as you might expect it to do, given the personnel involved. Instead, the quartet mostly just keep things simmering away nicely, as a result, falling somewhere between the uncanny, lo-fi jamming of 90s era no-neck blues band and the most obtuse strangeness that the 80s industrial scene had to offer. The second track sounds altogether less sonically claustrophobic and mummified, opening with serene washes of echo-heavy synth. This peaceful, new age vibe is soon disrupted by freeform drum and feedback guitar interjections from the Mouthus fellas, which build in intensity, things eventually smearing out into a long-form, ambient drone section, peppered by percussive knocks, weird guitar loops, and again, whatever other indescribable audio strangeness that they managed to conjure up with their devices that day. So, whilst this is nowhere near one of the defining statements of the aforementioned scene, and it's probably going to mostly appeal to those already deeply into the members' main projects, as I say, it's still a cool artifact from that era, and it can still be picked up dirt cheap online. Next up, we have a bunch of early electronic albums by the polymath Jim O'Rourke. Now, as with many, I first became aware of O'Rourke through magazine coverage of his phenomenal singer-songwriter releases like Eureka and Insignificance, and his involvement with indie-adjacent bands like Sonic Youth and Wilco. As far as his early solo work was concerned, though, before Eureka hit the shelves in 1999, the majority of his output was, simply put, a galaxy away from that comparatively accessible stuff. This one, Tamper, first emerged in 1991 on the Australian label Extreme, which is probably most famous for putting out Merzbau's legendary 50-disc Merz box, as well as numerous works by Muslim Gauze. Now, I'll be honest, I've blown hot and cold with Jim's avant-garde stuff, oftentimes finding it too po-faced and academic sounding, or just plain boring. Thankfully, Tamper is decent. It's 3 extended pieces, comprising of a succession of cold, grey, austere drones, which emerge from long stretches of silence, and oftentimes sound a bit like the industrial hum of overhead power cables. For a bit of colour, O'Rourke adds occasional discernible classical instrumentation from outside players, scrabbling violins, lonesome cello sawing, spooky choral vocals, and cranky oboe sonorities, as well as some heavily modified cymbal abuse, very much in the vein of Eddie Prevost from AMM. All in all, this is very shadowy, moody stuff, and if you've got understanding neighbours, or better still, if you have no neighbours at all, it's probably best enjoyed playing at full blast in a darkened room. Next up, we have the double CD Disengage from 1992. Now, each disc is given over to a different composition, the first one being taken up by the three-part Mia. As on Tamper, this piece utilises guest musicians on cello, bass trombone and vocals, as well as one chap playing shortwave radio, though this time around, for the most part, you'd be hard-pressed to pick out any of their contributions, thanks to O'Rourke's electronic processing. Yeah, his deft post-production wizardry basically swallows and obscures everything in its path, spitting the source sounds back out as 45 minutes of pure, unadulterated dronage, ranging from the rich, gorgeous and harmonic gush of part 1 to the extremely quiet and distant-sounding swells of part 3. Disc 2 is taken up by the 51-minute A Young Person's Guide to Drowning, which is split into 2 parts and was co-written by violinist Warren Fisher. As you might expect from the title, this isn't an easy ride. The first part moving from brooding dark ambience and subtle lakeside field recordings into a nightmarish sequence of layered electronics, which seems to mimic the sounds of emergency service vehicles and life support equipment, the chaos eventually giving way to several minutes more of near silence. The second part isn't quite as dramatic or eventful, mostly concentrating on long, echo-heavy smears of violin bowing and subtle clouds of ambience, with only a short section of electronic mangling on hand to interrupt the sombre atmosphere. Now, as far as I can recall, this is the first time I've revisited Disengage since I bought it nearly 20 years ago. Yeah, it's safe to say that I didn't really think much of it on my initial play. I remember getting especially annoyed by all the barely audible sections, which just seemed like a tedious waste of disk space. Granted, I'm still not overly enamoured by such tomfoolery, though overall, it would seem I'm a lot more tolerant of the album. Yeah, happily, there's more than enough here to save it from the dreaded sales pile for at least a few more years. Finally, from O'Rourke, we have Remove the Need, a live CD from 1993, not to be confused with the 1989 cassette of the same name, which I've never heard and apparently features completely different material. And yeah, along with the solo guitar cassette, Some Kind of Pagan, which I reviewed on my old blog ages ago, I'd say this is perhaps my favourite of his early efforts. In short, it's another drone fest with Jim coaxing out all manner of dark, industrialised sonorities, again from a lone electric guitar, ranging from singing, ringing metallic tones and woozy, microtonal glissandi, to menacing, bowed buzzes and low, bowel-shaking feedback groans. I recall reading somewhere, most probably in Wire magazine, that O'Rourke often used to perform guitar-centric gigs using some kind of complex, remote control-operated electronic system, meaning he could actually leave the instrument to do its thing up on the stage whilst he manipulated the sounds from the comfort of the audience. I don't have the article to hand at the moment, but I'm pretty sure they were talking about it in relation to this CD. Whatever the case, he's definitely up to something here, as it frequently sounds like there are several guitars playing simultaneously, which was something I noted in the aforementioned blog review of Some Kind of Pagan, though on that one, apparently he conjured up the sounds with next to no effects, which is pretty impressive. And yeah, call me lazy, but along similar lines to what I said about that tape all those years ago, if you appreciate stuff like Soliloquy for Lilith by Nurse with Wound, Early Organum, How to Destroy Angels by Coil, and other such cold, bleak, rusted soundscaping, then this one comes highly recommended too. Okay, to finish, let's delve into some Prurient, the well-established main project of US artist Dominick Fernow. Prurient has covered all sorts of electronic styles since its inception back in the late 1990s, though in this video I'll be concentrating on a few releases from the early to mid-2000s, when it was primarily a vehicle for harsh noise and power electronics. And we start with Troubled Sleep from 2003, which was one of the very first pro CDs bearing the Prurient moniker, after a string of low-run tapes, CDRs, and vinyl releases. At 28 minutes, this is a nicely compact blast of energy. Opener, bolt, beginning with the sound of classical music being fed through Fernow's mangler. The sample piece, at first, glitching out like crazy, then eventually being swallowed whole by waves of harsh static and wheezes of microphone feedback. All the while, Fernow's garbled voice is also fighting to be heard beneath all the chaos, eventually breaking through in the dying seconds, though it's still extremely difficult to make out what he's screaming. As it turns out, a quick glance at the insert reveals that the hyper-surrealistic lyrics to this album are taken from a poetry book entitled Crossing the Great Divide, which was written by Fernow's mother, Jean Ferraca. Following a couple of short, sharp noise bursts, the title track also utilises the sound of sentimental classical strings, though on this occasion they're allowed to breathe a bit more, contrasting nicely against the fried-out distortion, right up until Fernow smothers them to death with another bout of vocal insanity. Perhaps my favourite track here is The Zealot, which pits ear-killing highs against mid-range, gravelly crunching and red raw screams, after which everything blows out nicely into jet engine rumbling as Fernow hollers away like a lunatic. As we approach the end of the disc, Tambourine gives our poor, suffering lug holes a break for a couple of minutes, with more of those gravelly sounds scratching on top of a distant sub-bass grumble, the tension building steadily until everything boils over into the album's last splurge of molten harshness. Then closer Tarantella consists mostly of ultra messed up, modified vocal utterances, atop further jet engine noise, the audio eventually dropping down to near silence for the last couple of minutes. Next up, Fossil is a much longer proposition, giving us two hulking tracks. The first, a collage of both short fragments and longer sections. The second, a continuous piece, all recorded live at a space known as the Candle Factory on Valentine's Day 2003. Once again, Fernow makes use of words from Crossing the Great Divide, alongside lines penned by Rumi, the legendary 13th century Persian poet, whilst musically he's joined by 5 other performers, including Drop Dead guitarist Ben Barnett, Viodre member Brian Gilroy, Jeff Plummer, who's best known for his noise project Immaculate Grotesque, and frequent collaborators Chris Lapke and Emily Salvatierra. The opening minutes of the first piece, With You, make good use of Plummer and Gilroy's synthesizers, with quiet daubs of moody space music, bookending a stretch of flatulent death droning and tortured feedback screech. Then, circa the 8-minute mark, all notion of subtlety and dynamics goes out the window, as Fernow cuts in with multiple sections of thoroughly nasty microphone torture and lung-busting yells of insanity, things closing out with an extended stretch of white-hot metallic drone that would turn Jim O'Rourke green with envy. With barely a second to catch our breath, we then plunge straight into Waiting, which again features prominent samples from stark, melancholic classical music. It's a while since I last heard it, so I might be wrong, but the string piece used here sounds like it might be the same one from Prurient's contribution to the Split album he did with Canadian black metalers Akitsa, which would make sense, seeing as that piece is entitled Fossil, and looking at the recording date, it would appear it was literally recorded the day after this concert took place. Anyways, other than the mangled orchestration, here the players mostly subject us to minute upon minute of raw noise abuse, the whooshing waves of harsh static, occasionally accompanied by free-form percussion smashing, or simply cutting out abruptly into mic feedback so high-pitched that even William Bennett might wince, everything grinding to a halt shortly after the 30-minute mark. So yeah, cool album overall, with plenty of enjoyable moments, though due to the rough and ready recording quality and the sheer length of the pieces, Fossil ends up a pretty punishing listen, even at low volume. I can only imagine how ludicrously loud this actually was in the room, and my ears bleed in sympathy for all those who were there during the performance. And yeah, speaking of bleeding ears, next up I'll say a few words about 2005's Black Vase, which was my introduction to Prurient not too long after the album came out. Yeah, I remember hearing the track Silent Mary, probably on MySpace or somewhere, and I ordered the CD on the strength of that. As brutal as that song is, it could only prepare me so much for the high-frequency onslaught that comprises much of the rest of the disc, the worst offender being the now notorious opener Roman Shower. Indeed, as with some of the Jim O'Rourke stuff I mentioned earlier, this track is another example of something that I'm basically hearing for the first time in almost 20 years. And it'll probably be another 20 years at least until I want to play it again. Yeah, as much as I love all types of extreme electronic music, there's only so much unbroken microphone whistle that I can sit through before I go insane. This piece consisting of nothing but the most dog-bothering frequencies for 10 minutes straight. It does get a touch less agonising after this point, Fernow tossing us a few crumbs, allowing the noise to simmer and fizz away at a lower register as he barks out a few snatches of lyrics. Otherwise, yeah, this is about as uncompromising and uncomfortable a start to an album as I've ever heard. The aforementioned Silent Mary is up next, and it still sounds as good to me as it did back in 2006. Fernow's feral vocal attack, surrounded by layers of hazy, almost watery white noise, as Chris Lapke pummels out a distinctive tribal drum motif in the background, turning the song into a strange, mutated slab of noise rock in the process. This is the first of several such drum-based songs on offer here, whilst things like Silver Flashlight and Lord of Love are altogether more free-form and improvised sounding. The catchy Sorry Robin predicts Fernow's later experiments with more traditional songwriting, its grinding, synth-punk riff, foreshadowing albums like Bermuda Drain. However, for me, the true highlight of the album is the hulking title piece, which hangs in the air like a huge, angry storm cloud for nigh on 18 minutes. Its dense layers of droning feedback constantly surrounded by sheet metal clatter as it builds and builds towards an almighty sonic downpour. So yeah, Roman shower aside, this is another good one. Okay, so it's sloppy and half-baked in a few spots, as you'd expect any 70-plus minute album recorded in a single day to be. But yeah, overall, the screwy, almost rock songs contrast nicely against the more epic, grandiose material. We finished this mini Prurient odyssey, and indeed the whole video with the Warriors, a split CD with those other darlings of the early 2000s US noise explosion, Wolf Eyes, whose bewilderingly huge discography makes Fernow look like a slacker in comparison. Okay, so despite being released slap bang in the middle of Wolf Eyes' brush with the mainstream, when they famously put out a clutch of releases via the grunge label Sub Pop and landed all manner of press attention, you won't find any of the fist-pumping, beer-swilling, song-based noise that they became best known for here. Instead, these two extended downer jams mostly operate at a much lower volume, lurching and crawling about as if they're lost in some hellish sonic sewer network. Opener The Terror Tank consists of assorted gurgles, grumbles, clicks, chirps and farts, which come and go with no particular rhyme or reason for 16 minutes or so. Then Human Animal, which would provide the title for their final sub-pop release in 2006, is altogether more rusted and grotesque sounding, with piercing sax squeals and peals of metallic feedback echoing off into the oppressive darkness. Meanwhile, Prurient's half of the CD is an edited version of the material that he first submitted to the legendary recycled cassette series a couple of years earlier. And yeah, I actually used to have this tape as well, but I sold it a good while back. If I remember correctly, my copy was dubbed over an album of novelty organ music. Anyways, across 11 tracks, ranging from 43 seconds to 7 minutes in length, Fernow basically just lets rip, firmly making up for the rather low-key and subdued opening salvo. Yeah, mostly consisting of a barrage of layered microphone feedback and ultra-processed vocals. He also thickens things out with assorted stretches of pulsing synth menace and field recordings. Not too much else to say about this one, other than to point out that it's an all-round solid listen and fits well with the other Prurient stuff discussed today. Okay, so that's it for another episode. If you like your music dark and noisy, then there's plenty of videos along similar lines in the channel's archives. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you again soon on the Acid Trash Jamboree.